Sony Animation had to have held Genndy at gunpoint to make this, because there's no way he would willingly sign off on a shitty sequel like this. Can't you just let the man make original content? Oh shit. I can't believe it. That was actually good. Genndy Tartakovsky's fixed. You might have heard about this by now, and let's just say people had strong feelings on it. Now, in all fairness, I can understand the heated backlash this movie received. The first traditionally animated movie in a long while, headed by the absolute legend himself, Genndy Tartakovsky, and it was going to be an adult animation like Primal. People were really excited to see what he would end up cooking. And it was a raunchy comedy about dogs making sex jokes. At best, people were really disappointed by the look of the trailer, and at worst, they were very disgusted by the material. And I honestly felt a little bit of both while having a strange curiosity for how it would turn out. The trailers really didn't sell me on this being of quality. So much of it was really just a compilation of crass sex jokes and toilet humor. The most uncreative and worn out material for not just adult animation, but adult comedies in general. However, unlike a lot of other people, I already knew what I was getting myself into. I knew about Genndy's plans for Fix for about a year now. A story following a bulldog trying to enjoy his last day as a full-fledged dog before he gets, well, fixed. So when I saw the trailer, I wasn't as surprised or as shocked as everyone else. In fact, this was actually a passion project going back over a decade. This was something Genndy wanted to make ever since 2006. But due to the usual studio interference and tax write-off garbage, it wouldn't be until years later when it was finally picked up by Netflix. If this was anybody else, chances are I might not have paid this movie any mind. But because this was the legendary Genndy Tartakovsky, curiosity got the better of me and I thought I could endure the vulgar stuff to see if there was something else underneath. But after a personal vow I made to never sign up for a Netflix subscription after some things happened, I would have to really go out of my way if I wanted to review this one. Luckily I was able to get access to the entire full movie thanks to the magic of being a pirate. Now before I go any further, I need to make this clear so it doesn't sound like I'm just being biased towards a creator I really admire. Genndy is not immune to making bad content. He's had his fair share of fumbles over the years in ways that have ended up ruining things that could have otherwise been perfect. I did just make a video going over the disaster that was Hotel Transylvania 4, and Primal's second season ended up suffering from some pacing issues near the end. But I think the most infamous one is how he completely dropped the ball with Samurai Jack's ending, so I'm not gonna act like Genndy is perfect and this movie was some kind of betrayal. I'm just gonna see what he turned out and hopefully it won't be so bad. And ultimately, Fixed is actually good. I've seen better, but I've seen worse too, so let's take a closer look. The first thing to note is that, yes, there is a lot of crass and immature sex jokes and toilet humor in this movie. And it's not so much that it's in the movie, but that it awkwardly holds on this stuff for drawn out periods of time. It actually gets very bad to look at. The plot just comes to a screeching halt so they can focus on how raunchy it can get or how much they can get away with showing on screen. And it can ruin the mood of the film for a lot of people. So much of it serves no purpose for furthering the story or any plot relevance. It's just here because, oh well, it's an adult comedy, so let's throw in a bunch of gross stuff. But what if we subtracted all this and just focus on the actual story and characters? Well, it's surprisingly engaging when it wants to be. The actual characters and their personalities, when you really look into it, are pretty standard and tropish. None of them ever get offensively annoying or insufferable, but they're pretty by the books for this kind of story. The everyman who has a crush on the girl and is too insecure to confess his feelings. The girl who actually likes him for who he is and they get into all sorts of shenanigans before finally getting to the point. The tough-talking best friend. The snooty jerk who acts as a rival for the love interest. The nerdy friend who acts like a mama's boy. The weird friend who's a mix between a deep thinker and an idiot. There's not a whole lot going for them personality-wise, and it can get cliché with how the story presents them. But what makes it interesting to watch is their chemistry. I didn't think I would end up saying this about the movie given its crazy premise, but there's actually a lot of very good dialogue. Conversations between the characters that explore their relationships and develop their chemistry and forward the story in a meaningful way. When you get past the crass sex jokes and toilet jokes, it actually has a pretty good flow. Nothing happens too quickly, so you get the sensation the writers are taking the time to flesh out the cast and how they interact with each other, building their relationships and getting you invested in what happens to them. My favorite example of this being the love story between Bull and Honey, which was so much better than it had any right to be. One thing that helps the relationship a lot is how they establish a long history between the two, being childhood friends who develop a close friendship over the years. It gives the relationship more solid ground to work on instead of just knowing each other for a few days or weeks. The way they communicate with each other feels like how best friends who've been living next to each other their whole lives would interact. They have fun, they joke around, they vent about their feelings in a way that they'd only do with someone they trusted for so long, and there's also some well-established tension with the impending dilemma of Bull getting neutered before he can confess his feelings. And even if there are some moments where the movie can be obvious in trying to set them up as a couple, it never becomes too foamed in. There's also some very good comedy in the movie that's driven by the characters and their chemistry instead of relying on any gross stuff. There's a sense of variety to how these lines are delivered, so their essence is pretty humorous while developing the dynamic between the cast. Things like Bull standing up for himself against Sterling, or the guys having one of those guy talks on the way to the dog park. Even some of the more crude stuff like Honey catching Bull in the act has a lot of character to it. It keeps the story moving by focusing on the characters and their relationships while putting in the effort to come up with something clever instead of lazy gross out. The film takes its time to set up jokes properly instead of just doing adult things for the sake of it, making the writing more intelligible and serving a practical purpose. And it also has a few interesting subversions of common tropes like the third act breakup, where the guys leave Bull at the end of the first act instead of the middle of the third one. It's a reasonable breakup given the pressure placed on Bull and how it causes him to disregard the others in a way that isn't intentional or malicious. And it makes them getting back together in the middle of the second act more refreshing. It gives more breathing room for the group to patch up their differences and develop their friendship instead of rushing the whole breakup thing in the last 20 minutes. And I think one of the things that really helps to make it appealing to watch is the direction of the animation. Everything just looks and feels very fluent and lively. The characters have very well grounded expressions where it never feels too restricted or too erratic. Their body language and facial expressions have a somewhat sophisticated look to them instead of being over-reliant on being too shocking or over the top. It makes the artwork very beautiful and mesmerizing to look at. I mean, except for the toilet jokes and on-screen balls. I was actually surprised by how much of this movie was driven by the characters and the dilemma of Bull losing his balls. There's a proper mix of timing and use of the character models to make the movement of everything on screen very appealing. And because of the amount of time Genndy spends on the characters, it makes the plot engaging and feel like it's going somewhere instead of getting stagnant. And the story is actually really good with how it establishes its premise. The first act takes its time to explain how a dog's balls are an important part of their stature, so when Bull finds out he's gonna lose his, it makes the gravity of his situation more effective. Because of the social status held by some of the dogs, it makes Bull's insecurities understandable, and it ties into his relationship with Honey very well. Bull is a mutt and Honey is bred to be a show dog, and with Sterling constantly shoving his inferiority in his face, of course it would make him question if he deserves her. But even after going through that whole dilemma, he still remains loyal to her. That's the main appeal to Bull and what makes his character arc compelling. He's not just a horn dog who always thinks about getting laid. He genuinely loves Honey and is struggling to come to terms with who he is due to the divide caused by the social class. When I saw that one scene in the trailer, I thought they were gonna go the predictable route and have him have a moment of weakness and he just goes with another female. But he actually remains committed to Honey and it leads to a misunderstanding. He thought he was giving Molasses a back rub while venting his feelings for Honey, and he genuinely regrets the situation he placed himself into. It all ties back into his arc about learning how his balls aren't what make up who he is, and how Honey admires him for his actual characteristics and his devotion to her. That's what surprised me most about Fixed. It actually puts a lot of time into giving growth to its main character as well as a few supporting characters like Lucky. He also gets a character arc about learning to accept himself and move past his insecurities, and his relationship with that Doberman is surprisingly wholesome and sweet. And the ending where it all comes full circle with Bull throwing himself in front of the Deke and finally working up the self-esteem to confess his love for Honey feels really rewarding because of it. Bull and Honey's relationship really made up a lot of the movie's core because the writers actually took the time to focus on it, and it makes that ending where they share a special night together and manage to have kids before Bull's neutering very sweet. It even has something of a bittersweet montage with Bull reminiscing on the time he spent with his balls and learning to let go and move on from them. It's a very good book into his character arc and makes him winning over Honey and starting a family with her really satisfying. Like I said before, I understand the initial reaction a lot of people are having to this movie because of its vulgar trailer, but after taking the time to actually watch it, Fixed is actually an engaging film with compelling characters that uses an interesting framework for telling its story. Watching it all the way through and knowing about the history behind its production, it feels like it was made from a place of genuine passion instead of just going the predictable route of, oh, this thing that's normally associated with family audiences is doing all sorts of crude, non-family friendly stuff. I do wish they could have been less in your face with the toilet jokes and ball jokes and put more time into developing the characters and their chemistry, but compared to what we usually get from adult comedies, and especially animated adult comedies, this was actually a good movie and another solid hit by Genndy Tartakovsky. It's a movie that shows how even after all the ups and downs, he's still a passionate, talented, and genuine artist who really cares about animation as an expressive art form, and he really wanted to use this film to explore the boundaries of what can be done with the medium. I don't know what exactly is next for Genndy Tartakovsky, but with another fun work under his belt, I'd say things are definitely looking up for him.